Hi all. So we're just waiting for everyone to finish logging into the presentation. But in the meantime, I want to take a moment to thank all the collaborators for the series. This is our third and final panel, and it's been a true labor of love that we've been working really hard on for months. And I really want to thank the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council for hosting us and supporting this project. I want to thank the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, who helped us with designing our redlining and gentrification 101 pamphlets that we've distributed in 5 languages in the community. I want to thank our other panelists, Karen Burch, Takashi Hoshizaki, of course, Jimmy Recinos, who's my collaborator on this panel. I want to thank James Bennett, who's helped with every technical aspect of this panel series. I would like to thank Doña Elvia for joining us last week as well, and for Stefano Medina of the LA Tenants Union, and our wonderful interpreters who have made this panel series accessible in Spanish, Monica Bravo and Rachel Ocheto. They've been really important in making sure our Spanish-speaking neighbors are able to join this panel. And if I'm missing anyone, JT, let me know.
Not missing anyone, but maybe a thing that we want to shout out, a very special news item.
Yes. So, this is our final panel of the 3-part series, but we wanted to make sure that this project lives on beyond just these 3 panels. So Jimmy and I have been hard at work actually working on a magazine that archives the themes of these 3 panels. So redlining and the stories of the history of the neighborhood, gentrification, and of course housing. So we actually have a pre-order available. We're gonna go to print next week. So if you want to pre-order our magazine, go to jimbotimes.com. jimbotimes.com. You are able to purchase the magazine. And just a note, because we are going to print next week, it might take up to a month to ship. But it's a really beautiful magazine. It is designed by China Monforte, who's an amazing designer. The cover art is by Chris Simatu, who helped us with our beautiful poster. And yeah, if you want something to hold on to that kind of archives these themes, it'll feature essays, photo essays, maps, definitions, and it's really like a beautiful way to keep something for this panel. It's like a keepsake, and it'll allow people to continue engaging with these themes. And also, Jimmy and I have been working for months now, and it is a labor of love, but if you want to keep supporting our work, this is kind of how you can do that. The money will go to keeping this work sustainable for us. All right, so Nina, do you want to talk a little bit about how people can join in Spanish?
Yes, I can talk about it. So good evening, everybody. My name is Nina Suarez. I'm the president of East Hollywood Neighborhood Council. I'm very excited to welcome everyone tonight to our panel discussion on redlining, gentrification, and housing in East Hollywood. And I'm going to talk about our translation. So this event is being offered with simultaneous Spanish language translation. And to access the service on your Windows or Mac computer, please click interpretation icon on the lower right of your webinar control panel, then select Spanish. And from the drop-down menu, also, you have the option to mute original audio here. And on your Android or Apple iOS phone, you can click the ellipsis, what are the 3 dots icon from your meeting controls, and then select Spanish from the drop-down menu. And you can also have an option to mute the original audio there and click done. And I'm going to say this in Spanish for our Spanish audience so they can have access to this translation. Este evento se cuenta con el servicio de interpretación simultáneo al idioma español. Para acceder a este servicio, en Windows o Mac OS, por favor, seleccione el icono Interpretación que se encuentra en la parte inferior derecha de su panel de control. Luego seleccione Spanish del menú de opciones. Asimismo, tendrá la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. En Android o Apple iOS, por favor, seleccione el icono de los puntitos suspensivos, que son los 3 puntos, que se encuentra en los controles de la reunión. Luego seleccione Spanish en el menú de opciones. Asimismo, tendrá la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. Seleccione Done. Muchas gracias y esperamos que lo disfruten. So I've been tasked this evening as well to talk about one of our Produce Box programs. I'm going to share a small little presentation about our Produce Box program. So hi everyone again. We have some amazing news. We've partnered with Rick's Produce and Children's Hospital and the council member Mitchell Farrell's office to have monthly Produce Box giveaways starting on April 18th and ending in December. Please look out for more information via our EHNC social media platforms, including our website and our newsletter. So the Produce Box program started as a response to the Safer at Home order issued by our city and county back in March of 2020. These orders essentially caused a panic throughout our city. Markets and grocery stores were not stocking fast enough to keep up with demand. Our first Produce Box distribution started on Easter Sunday, April 12th, 2020, and it started with a few neighbors and my personal friends who donated money and their time to purchase and deliver produce boxes. In May, the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment allowed our neighborhood council to allocate emergency funding to support the pandemic. We decided to purchase produce boxes from our local farm to market grocer, Rick's Produce Market. Over the last 10 months, we have given away over 2,000 produce boxes to our stakeholders in East Hollywood. I want to personally thank our volunteers that have helped us throughout the last few months, including Myra, Jules, Caitlin, Alejandra, Ruben, and the Children's Hospital staff that organized on-site volunteers. If you want to volunteer, please email me or check out our volunteer Google form found on our Instagram. To learn more about our Produce Box program, please visit JT, the LA Storyteller podcast, episode 17. The East Hollywood Neighborhood Council was given in 2020 to 2021 $32,000 in funding to allocate in our neighborhood. And we can do that in 3 ways: through outreach, community improvement projects, and neighborhood purpose grants. This 3-part panel series is a recipient of our neighborhood purpose grant. You can get involved with our neighborhood council by being part of all these committees listed here: arts and culture, budget and finance, but business, bylaws, ethics and standing rules, executive, homeless and displacement prevention, outreach, LGBTQ+ alliance, planning and land use management, or PLUM, public safety and sustainability, youth and education. Becoming involved in our neighborhood councils are important because we can support programming such as our Produce Box giveaways, as well as this 3-part panel series. To find out more about our governing board meetings or committee meetings, please visit our website, which is www.easthollywood.net. And thank you. I want to introduce our host for tonight, which is Jimmy Recinos, and he's the editor-in-chief of Jimbo Times and the host of JT, the LA Storyteller podcast.
Nina, thank you so much for that presentation. And it is really an honor to learn about the path of this produce program that played such a crucial role during the year of the pandemic, especially right at the early part of the pandemic and then also closer towards the end. And this program is also one that's returning. But I do want to emphasize that if it were not for particularly Nina's leadership on that produce program, there are hundreds, possibly even up to 1,000 families who would have never gotten fresh fruits and veggies for their sopa de vegetables over the pandemic. So I do want to emphasize that the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council is an instrument that, especially when we've got good ideas and a lot of persistence, we can make some really good things out of, right? When life gives you lemon, make lemonade, if you will. Certainly that's what the EHNC has been, and certainly that's what it's looked like under Nina's leadership and courage in taking these steps for our community. So we've got a really special panel tonight, and this is the third and final panel of our three-part series. As Samanta so graciously noted earlier, it's been a long project for us. We've also been hard at work on putting together a magazine for you all over the last couple of weeks, just to make sure that this project lives on. And of course, today was also the Hollywood Community Update Plan public hearing. And I do have a statement from United Local 11 just regarding immediate response to basically what we learned from the LA City Planning Commission earlier today regarding their proposals / recommendations for LA City Hall, which we'll get into. We're going to sort of break down the Hollywood Community Update Plan a little later in our presentation, but I just want to read this very brief statement from United Local 11, a local union for hotel workers and other folks in service in the Hollywood area who've been spearheading the Just Hollywood Coalition. We're disappointed in the vote that the Planning Commission took today. We asked for tenant protection so that new buildings don't replace rent-controlled housing without more than full replacement. They said that Hollywood should wait. We asked for affordable housing. The commission voted to double the building size before developers are required to do anything. Essentially, the fear now is that we'll get about 10% affordable housing units inside of huge skyscrapers. We wanted more say on which hotels could enter our communities and more housing, more affordable housing, but the LA City Planning Commission did not do that today. So we'll get into more specifics for all that in just a moment, but I'm going to take us through our presentation. Also, before I forget, Sammy also pointed this out to me. This has been a trying week for a lot of us. We have been watching the news and keeping up with the news and been totally shocked and also frustrated and outraged by heinous acts of violence against communities of color in this country, which are persistent, but which have these particularly traumatic moments for us, right? We're sort of in a cycle here. And so I do believe that it only underscores the importance of multi-ethnic work that is inclusive of various ages, various backgrounds, various languages. And certainly that has been this project for us. We've grown so much in working with so many different kinds of people just over the last year, over the last couple of years. And so we wish this on every community. We wish this for every community because it is a gift. It is a liberation to free ourselves from racist mentalities. And certainly we've seen that over the course of this project. And we wish this for more of our communities, especially as we heal. We hope that tonight is a special storytelling session for everyone that ultimately looks towards community, because that's what we do despite everything. Certainly that's what we've seen with redlining, gentrification, and housing in East Hollywood. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm just going to get right into a very brief presentation, kicking off housing, the fight for housing in our community. So let's go right here. One moment. Okay, yeah. Okay, so in December, I published an article titled, "It's Now Time to Ask If Gentrification is a Fourth Wave of Jim Crow Policy." If you haven't been able to read that yet, I highly recommend it. It informs a lot of certainly my sort of approach towards this really incredible panel series that we're now getting through. I don't know why that picture showed up, but it just did. Cheers. We're going to go through a short video clip, which was taken in December as well, actually, December 2020, and in the Little Armenia area in East Hollywood. So as you can see there, this is the destruction of what appears to be a single family home in the Little Armenia area. And the reason that this is particularly alarming is because less than a mile from this home is the 101 freeway, which is filled with encampments set up by the unhoused in East Hollywood. By last count, there are at least 4,000 people without shelter, 3,200 of which on any given night have no place to sleep except the sidewalk or places like the freeway. And so this was in December. December, some of you all might recall, was about maybe the 7th month of what was supposed to be Project Room Key. Project Room Key was something that the LA Homeless Services Authority was supposed to initiate so that at least 15,000 of our approximately 60,000 unhoused individuals would be sheltered immediately given the COVID-19 scare. But as you can see, by November 23rd, Project Room Key Tracker, a data analysis of the city's progress, marked that not even 5,000, less than 5,000 of the goal of 15,000 were in fact in hotels for temporary shelter. So for me, what is particularly grotesque about watching a home being destroyed as we have homeless encampments is that you don't need to go to planning school to understand that you don't destroy housing that is much needed, especially when there are people less than a mile away who need that shelter. So before we get into the big logistics and some of the major debate here, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is actually Chancey Martrell. And Chancey, unless I've missed anything, please tell us a little bit about your work in Thai-Town and your work at Thai CDC regarding housing, especially affordable housing for immigrant communities, for Black and immigrant communities in East Hollywood.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I feel so honored and privileged to have been invited to be on this panel that addresses gentrification and displacement in East Hollywood, a community that I love and hold dearly in my heart because Thai Community Development Center has been working in this community for almost 30 years, 26 years to be exact.
And Chancey, actually, to be sure, we do have one note that I missed. We'll get right into your presentation. Sammy, take it away for us, and then we will hear from Chancey.
Sure, not at all, not a problem.
Sorry about that, Chancey. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of capture a summary of what we've talked about in the last 2 panels and how it relates to this panel. So, you know, in the first panel, we talked about redlining and these like historic forms of exclusion and disinvestment in our neighborhood and how that disinvestment led to neighborhoods like ours being vulnerable to gentrification and displacement. So the reason that we're focusing on housing for this panel is because housing really is the future. And it's one of the, when people ask, you know, what are the solutions to gentrification? I get that question a lot on my Instagram account, This Side of Hoover. And, you know, the solutions are complex, they are big, but one of those solutions includes dealing with the affordable housing shortage that is in the tune of 500,000 units that are needed in our communities. And so this panel will really focus on housing as we look towards the future. And this is why we've brought this group of panelists together, because they've really been fighting for equitable housing in our communities, and they can really speak to some of the solutions. And this is why I'm really honored to introduce Chancey Martrell, who is a really important figure in Los Angeles and in East Hollywood specifically. She's worked for decades on creating equitable solutions for the Thai community specifically. And her story and the story of her organization, Thai Community Development Center, is really one story to look towards as a success story and as a story of what we can do as communities, right? So Chancey, I'm really honored to introduce you. Please tell us a little bit about the history of Thai CDC, the history of disinvestment in East Hollywood, and how your organization has fought back to create more equitable opportunities for the community.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Samantha and JT. I'll just go right into it without further ado. Thai Community Development Center was founded in 1994 on the idea that all peoples have a basic right to decent standard of living and quality of life. And since its establishment, we've addressed the multifaceted needs of Thai and other disadvantaged communities faced with substandard housing conditions and lack of access to basic health services, education, and quality employment opportunities. We were founded in the aftermath of two crises, the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles and the also 1994 Northridge earthquake. Both crises had a devastating effect on not just the Thai community, but the minority communities around the area that had been adversely impacted by these two crises, and left people displaced from their homes, jobs, and businesses. So Thai CDC was born out of that crisis. And the images that you're seeing right now are some of the historic buildings that are located there in East Hollywood that really had been neglected over time. When Thai CDC was founded back in 1994, it was really after 30 years of neglect of this area, this neighborhood now known as East Hollywood, because the area had suffered urban decay and blight and lack of any kind of investment or capital infusion or economic development. And so to compound that with then the civil unrest and then the Northridge earthquake, where now we need to not only rebuild East Hollywood, but make it thrive and prosperous for all of the stakeholders and members who make up this community. And this community happens to be the most diverse community in Los Angeles, represented by Armenians and Latinx and Thai immigrants. And we coexist together, living, working, doing business alongside each other. And we really help to turn this community around. So you'll see now some of these historic buildings like this one, Don Carlos building, which then got preserved and got some of the rebuilding dollars after the earthquake to come to standard and also receive the kind of renovation that it should receive. And then you saw photos earlier of the Mayor building, which used to be the Louis B. Mayer office that became the MGM studios that all of us are familiar with. That, of course, is how Hollywood, the romanticized, glamorous version of Hollywood is known for, right? The movie studios and the production of film. Well, this is a historic building, and it got renovated as well as part of the East Hollywood redevelopment plan. And so in the birth of Thai CDC, then came this campaign to really begin looking at how we could turn the neighborhood around. So we campaigned then for the designation of Thai Town for this area, because it has served historically as a port of entry for newly arrived Thai immigrants going back to the 50s. And because there's been a proliferation of Thai-owned businesses, and the Thai workers became an integral part of the Thai workforce, we felt that the fact that this neighborhood already has some of these cultural assets, we should try to use cultural tourism and creative placemaking as a way to generate economic development and to create jobs. As a organization that's trying to bring about equity, we are not only emphasizing turning neighborhoods around, but one of the major facets of helping stabilize communities is really to build affordable housing. And this is what this panel is on, is the importance of housing. While we do affordable housing, we have built hundreds of units of affordable housing in Hollywood and outside of Hollywood. We also define community development broadly. And so we are also engaged in small business development, entrepreneurship, financial literacy. And one of the projects that is currently underway right now in Thai Town is this business incubator and social enterprise we're building called the Thai Town Marketplace, which you see there. And that will help create 18 micro enterprises and also generate about 40 plus jobs in the community. It will be a community benefit because it's going to be on the Metro stop, which is the Western Gateway of Thai Town at Hollywood and Western. That's the Red Line subway station. And it provides a low-cost entry point to low-income immigrants to start a micro enterprise and business. And one of the other things we always engage in order to really engage the community is a lot of community planning and democratizing the planning process, which we could go back to when we talk about planning. But the other project that we also have here in Thai Town, as you can see, is our farmers market. Our farmers market, known as the East Hollywood Certified Farmers Market, is located right at the Portal Plaza of the Hollywood and Western subway station. And it's really a project that helps to provide access to affordable fresh produce to low-income members of the community who shop there and are able to use their public benefits. And we are able to do electronic benefit transfers or EBT transactions, and are able to provide market matches, a one-for-one match, $1 basically to dollar match of what they spend on their public benefit, and double their purchasing power to increase their consumption and purchase of produce. So these are some of the projects we are engaged in. And the other thing that I want to talk about is that if we want to ensure equity in this area, not only has Thai CC sort of become this force to be reckoned with, and as some people have described us to be, but also a sort of a gatekeeper around the interests, the material and social interests of disadvantaged and vulnerable members of the community. And so it was back in 1998 that Thai CC pushed for a community vision of what the plan should be around the metro stops that became the ordinance that got passed in 2001 called the Station Neighborhood Area Plan. And if you could go to the next slide, the Station Neighborhood Area Plan had these elements that we actually had ensure be included in the guidelines for developers to follow. And those elements in the specific plan include that developers, if they're going to build anywhere near the Metro Red Line station, specifically a quarter to up to a half-mile radius around the Metro Red Line station, they have to develop a project that would encourage increased public services and increase access to transportation, public transportation, because it is a transit-oriented community after all, and that would promote walkability, that would increase public safety, that would also promote some public improvements or increase public improvements in the area, that would create more jobs that are living wage, and also jobs that would be filled by local members of the community, and also, of course, most importantly, more affordable housing around transit, and promotion of small mom and pop businesses, not just the chain stores, and a real environment that promotes civic life and that could help to socially integrate the diverse members of the community. And so yes, so TICC has been involved in not just the brick and mortar of community development at the micro level of helping people become economically self-sufficient through financial literacy, access to capital, ability to start their businesses, and what have you, but also at the macro level, the neighborhood level, where we are trying to address blight and urban decay and disinvestment and turn neighborhoods around, beautified neighborhoods, preserve its features and assets and historic assets as well, and also build more affordable housing and promote small business development and expand those businesses and create those businesses and create these jobs, but also, so it's a form of individual asset building and also a form of community asset building, but also TICC, because we are addressing not just equity, we're addressing long-term sustainability of communities. It's very important that we absolutely focus on the most marginalized and the most invisible and voiceless and disadvantaged, so that they could participate in the planning process. We try to open up and democratize the planning process because they are the authentic voice, and they should be driving the planning process, and they should be the ones to sustain all that they want to see in their community, and what will help the community thrive in the long run, to make sure it's green and beautified, and it's a local economy that works for everyone, and it creates the living wage jobs that everyone can live off of, and does not displace any of their mom and pop businesses. And at the same time, TICC also addresses the issues of human rights, immigrant rights, workers' rights, because we do a lot of advocacy around that as well. So so that's Thai Community Development Center history, and the resiliency part, as I mentioned, you know, we've gone through a lot. We had to endure the neglect of over the past 30 years before TICC got started. Then we had to endure the adverse impact of the 92, followed by the 94 Northridge earthquake. So this community has really gone through a lot and has shown a lot of resilience. And now we're a transit-oriented community, and we need to create more equity around transit. And that's why we're doing a lot of development around transit, because we believe that such a large investment in such a public asset and public infrastructure should produce community benefits for the community. And that's why we have our farmers market there. And that's why we're going to have our Thai Town marketplace there, which will also promote social integration, and it'll be an anchor for economic development and neighborhood revitalization. And and also be a hub for the community as well. And affordable housing, of course, is key, because affordable housing is what's going to stabilize the community through and through. Because first and foremost, housing is a human right, and people really need to be able to have a roof over their head if you expect people to contribute back to society and be a contributing member of our community.
Chancey,
So with
thank
that,
you
I guess
so
I will
much.
conclude. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I
Yeah.
did want to ask like a quick follow-up, like, you know, it seems like early on, as you were starting Thai CDC, you kind of saw the potential for the community to go through gentrification, and you kind of acted preemptively, it seems like, right? To kind of curb some of the negatives effects that could happen with gentrification, like displacement. What was your thinking around that, and how did you kind of deal with your thoughts around like the possibility of the neighborhood gentrifying?
Yes, well, as soon as we learned that the Metro Red Line was going to come through East Hollywood back in 1998, we immediately responded by bringing together multiple stakeholders, the community, and these were diverse stakeholders. And we demanded from city planning and our city council member and from Metro that any kind of construction may possibly, even if it was temporarily displacing businesses, may possibly have this real negative impact on the community. So there should be some kind of reparation for the community, or some kind of way for businesses to continue operating during construction, and there'll be enough signage to direct people to the businesses, because with all the construction, it might look like all the businesses are closed and what have you. So after we initiated those conversations, we also went further into talking about how, well, if there's going to be that kind of investment in public dollars into this massive public infrastructure, it's the public that should benefit. It should be a public asset. And so how are you, Metro, going to develop around the metro stations? Are you going to be attracting more market rate housing? Because Metro wants economic development and revenue generated from economic development around their stations, but all that revenue being generated may benefit Metro, but how's it benefiting the community? So should not that housing be affordable housing, and should not all of the economic development be focusing on helping local businesses as opposed to attracting chain stores and what have you? And so then the city of LA, through city council, then decided to contract Thai CDC, since we were so vocal about it. They decided to contract Thai CDC to do some community planning and community engagement, and through all that community engagement and planning process, where we had brought all the community stakeholders together. In fact, we did this at LACC because we needed a lot of space to bring every member of the community over from different sectors and different ethnic groups, you know, talking about businesses and residents and seniors and youth and workers across all ethnic groups, and in multiple languages. So we had all these translators, and did what we called some focus groups and visioning exercises, and just have the community tell us what would you like to see within the quarter mile up to half mile radius around these Metro Red Line stops. And so they wanted to see, first and foremost, affordable housing. So they wanted to make sure that there's affordable housing, that this community does not turn into a community that will be just completely gentrified by market rate housing and displaced people who are the social fiber of this community for 30 some years, 40 years. And then they want to see improvements in terms of the public infrastructure, and they want to see amenities and more public facilities, and they wanted to see protection of the small businesses. They want to see more greening, more open space, improved walkability, and more pedestrian friendly environments, especially if it's going to be a transit-oriented community. And so we put all of that together in this vision, and we submitted that to City Council, which then got submitted to City Planning, and then it got adopted as a specific plan called the Station Neighborhood Area Plan. And that was in 2001, and it's a 20-year plan, which now will sunset soon, but then it's going to be capped. And that has really prevented developers from all of the catalytic developments you see around Central Hollywood now, and that we're disputing in this current Planning Commission hearing on the Hollywood Community Plan update. And we wanted to promote the Just Hollywood Plan for that reason, because what the specific plan did was it really prevented developers from building high and from adding parking. And with limited parking and height restrictions, developers then were prevented from building these major projects, huge projects, and from engaging in this kind of catalytic developments that would have pushed people out and gentrified the whole neighborhood. And so the Station Neighborhood Area Plan, our specific plan, really became this tool that prevented sort of apartheid in East Hollywood and displacement, and that was because at the very get-go we kind of preemptively, like you said, had to take action.
Yeah, thank you, Chancey. Jimmy, do you want to introduce our other panelists?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you to Chancey. Thank you to Sammy for that excellent follow-up question. I will introduce first Lee. Joining us for this panel, I'll ask everyone to turn on their cameras. I'm going to introduce first Roderick Hall. Roderick is actually the Research Planning and Spatial Equity Project Manager at Pacific Urbanism, a community enterprise focused on using data and research to build more equitable communities. And we are also joined by Caroline Calderon of the Little Tokyo Services Center, which is actually installing a new extremely affordable income housing complex at none other than Vermont and Santa Monica, the Vermont and Santa Monica intersection. So it's a famous, it's a very famous intersection, very sort of pivotal intersection for what is East Hollywood. And so there's change coming, there's change. And I think, Samanta, something really great to see earlier was you're posting about LTSC actually, and then getting a little bit of feedback in terms of, oh, is this another gentrification project? A whole new development displacing the community again? And so we're actually here to break this down a little bit and really sort of dissect what is going on and whether all development is good or not good, and so on and so forth. So that's what we aim to do with this panel, which is going to be more of a conversation between all of us, more of a dialogue that everyone is allowed to jump into, if you will. And so, Sammy, do you want to kick us off with our first question for the room?
Yeah, I want to take us to some essential grounding, a grounding question. And my first question that I want to ask of the panelists is housing a human right? And if so, why?
I'll answer. So, for me, I think, one, I just have to say before I even start speaking, thank you to the both of you for doing this entire series. I think obviously I'm not from Los Angeles. Well, that's not obvious, but I'm not from Los Angeles. I'm from a small town in North Carolina. But, growing up as both a poor person, working class, low income person, and also as a person of color, among many other things, I think is very important that we tell our narratives ourselves, because we're the only people positioned to really speak on that. So, whether you have people like myself or Caroline or Chancey who went to planning school, or you have other people of color who go into journalism, it is all very important for me because it is all working together for a better vision for our community. So I really want to just thank y'all both for this. First and foremost, I'm a big believer in giving people their flowers while they're here. So there's that. But then the second piece being, it's been very eye-opening for me. I just moved to Los Angeles last year to come into housing here and seeing what the housing issues are in Los Angeles. It's been a lot to say the least, but I say all that to say I do think that housing is a human right. I think we have more than enough evidence on what happens when people don't have shelter or a stable home. But more importantly, there's also evidence that talks about the psychological impacts of displacement to people, right? Like, as a person whose ancestors were kidnapped from their lands and brought to a foreign place, and then being on a panel with people whose families, whether they are indigenous, being Oaxacan, or just other folks of color who immigrated here, we all have this shared history of land and housing and just very tumultuous things that forces us all to bond, maybe a little too much over trauma, which is not always the best, but we do anyways. And so I think for me, when I think about that history and knowing the research and the data that's out there, it's no longer a question of, is housing a human right? I think that should be a given at this point in 2021. I mean, we're just entering the year, but I think it should be a given. And I think that because we know what having not only a home, but a sense of ownership and a sense of being in this country and in this system, being in control of your life, when you are a person who doesn't always get that, what it means and what it does to people over the long-term run. And I think, every day having to leave my home and see people on the streets, first and foremost, directly on the sidewalks, is very jarring for me because I don't come from a place where that's common. And I can't imagine waking up every day and thinking, oh yeah, people don't deserve housing. That's just not in me, both from a religious and spiritual standpoint, but also just from a morality standpoint. So yeah, that's just my answer to that. I'll let everyone else answer.
Good evening. Building off what Roderick shared, absolutely, housing is a human right. Everyone has the right for decent and safe housing where you could be your most authentic self, where you could, not having housing is a detriment to people's wellness, to people's physical and mental being. So absolutely, housing is a human right. And the neighborhoods that you help cultivate, or that the neighborhoods that are dear to you and you have created memories and you've built relationships, you also have a right to stay in those neighborhoods.
Well, I already spoke a whole lot, and I already mentioned housing is human rights, so I will give the time back to our hosts.
Thanks so much. That does lead into our next question, which is regarding this series, right, which has been redlining, gentrification, and housing in East Hollywood, but also throughout Los Angeles. At the beginning of our panel, we had two elders in our communities, an African-American elder, a Japanese-American elder, and during our second panel, we were privileged enough to hear from another longtime elder, that of Doña Elvia of Superpan Bakery. And so time and time again, even just studying this history, studying the history of housing in a city like Los Angeles, while we in 2021 believe it's very clear that housing is a human right, That has not been the sort of concerted policy of the city, not in practice and not currently, right? Clearly, there's a contradiction, a tension. So you don't have to sort of be a planning expert to understand that something is amiss here. When we see that most people on the street happen to be African-American males, followed by immigrant communities, there's a disproportion here, right? So what I want to ask actually is, if housing is actually very sort of clearly a Black and immigrants' rights issue, given policies of redlining, policies of deed restrictions, policies of exclusionary communities that disallowed and that fought tooth and nail to ensure that there was no housing actually for Black and immigrant communities. I'd like to ask if this is sort of something we need to call out as a Black and immigrants' rights issue, and therefore as a race issue in Los Angeles and throughout our country.
I was gonna let Caroline go first. um, Especially for me, you know, and one, I just did this, but I think, you know, listening to Chancey speak on our past conversation this Friday, and listening to someone who's a woman of color speak about going to grad school and talking about trying to learn about, you know, affordable housing and financing. It was one, very insightful because, you know, that was a part of my own grad school journey. But I think when I think about housing and we think about this issue, it's housing, and it's just so much more. I think we all know that because, you know, a community isn't just the housing. It's, you know, I have this background of like Wakanda and like an aerial view of the streets, and you can see like a bus is right here. You can see public transit there. You see people and you see markets and you see these things that have always existed in Asia and in Latin America. And you see it existing in Africa. You know, we've seen these things exist in our communities for centuries. You see it in cocoa, right? Like, I chose that image because it's so beautiful. Density, what is that, right? Like, you see folks celebrating what is a very Latin culture-oriented way of designing our built environment, which I think is just so beautiful to see in movies and cinema. And that really does speak to our own issues. But I think when you think about homelessness and you think about overcrowding, because the Latino community especially dealt with overcrowding in COVID-19 over the past year, I think, and I mentioned this on the call, we don't have a housing system that doesn't know how to not center the white middle class, if I'm being honest. When you think about redlining, you think about these issues that y'all have all talked so, you know, well about over the past two panel series. And someone said it last week, our system is designed to protect white capital, whatever that means, right? Like, it's not designed to give someone like me wealth. And we know that because Andre Perry put out a report that talked about the devaluation of Black homes within Black communities. And that lends itself to understanding what Latino, Asian, and Indigenous and Pacific Islander folks are also going through, where because of the color of our skin, our homes are going to be valued less, our communities are deemed less, you know. And so for me, when I think about, you asked this question, should we confront this through race? We absolutely should, because at the end of the day, when you think about housing, it's not just, oh, well, if we give people housing in a more economic, you know, safe area, they're okay. Because like, when I think about Trayvon Martin, or I think about the Asian family in Orange County who was like being, you know, essentially attacked by young white people at every step of the corner, whether our housing is in our communities or it's in a white community, we are dealing with something that is causing our health and well-being to be put on the line for our survival. So it's something for me that, like, when you talk about housing inequity, I would hope that as the Biden-Harris administration is talking about building back better, and our governor is thinking about like housing, and our city council is thinking about housing, is something that doesn't kick in and say, let me reflect and let me center this for just the white middle class. Because the last time that happened, we got redlining, we got the demolishment of our communities, we got, well, you're not welcomed here if you are anything but Anglo-white. And that to me is connected to the history of what indigenous people have been going through for centuries, of like understanding that, you know, you took land from people, you broke treaties, and you said, well, this area is now desirable for white folks, so we're going to get rid of anyone who's not that to make way for that. And I don't really think, and that's been our housing market in its entirety since, you know, the foundation of this country. That's how it started, making way for white people by clearing out non-whites, if you will. So for me, when I think about this issue, and I like grew up seeing plantations, and I grew up seeing all these other things that reminded me that that's what we exist for, it's not again, these things are no longer questions for me. Like, is this a race issue? Is this a this issue? It's more so, how are we coming out of this and designing systems that don't continue to perpetuate it?
Can I also add that because we're in a capitalist economy and system, housing unfortunately has become commodified. Housing should not be a commodity. Housing should be, like we had said, a human right. And if we're going to really address structural inequalities in this country and systemic racism, and trying to reduce the wealth and income inequalities and all the social and economic disparities, we need to make housing a human right and really fundamental as a benefit for all people. And and when it comes to very low income, economically disadvantaged people, housing must be affordable. They must not pay more than 30% of their income on housing. How else would they be able to have enough to spend on other basic necessities, on groceries, on their children's education, and all the other basic things that maybe you and I can enjoy and take for granted, whereas they have to be scrimping and making ends meet. We cannot create a society where we have such a growing underclass that we then are accepting that we are creating a permanent underclass. We cannot come to the point where we've come to accept the creation of permanent underclass, because that is exactly what we are creating. And I don't see that as a healthy and thriving economy. Our economy should be one that is equitable and democratized, and that provides everyone equal opportunity, and that works for everyone. And it starts with housing.
And can you just define equity for us and what equitable means as opposed to equality?
I have a slide for that, if you saw. You could bring up that slide.
Yeah, let me find that.
Did you see that slide?
Yeah. Just want to make sure people have an understanding of these of the words that we're using, because there is a difference.
Yes, there is a difference, but I think that slide would be really, really good. It's one of the, there it is, terms to remember. So there's, yeah, so there's the image that shows the distinction between equality and distinction between equity. So I will put it out there. What do you see in terms of the difference between the two?
It looks like equality is something in which everyone is given the same object and expected to have the same outcome, whereas equity provides different instruments or tools for different needs.
Yes, because equality did not address the person's, the disabled person's access, whereas equity did address that disabled person's access, to enjoy the same benefits, right? I mean, equality might have allowed the disabled person into this, I guess, sports arena or game, as well as allowed people of color and a child, but then they weren't at the same level. Whereas equity provided equal access to everyone, regardless of race, gender, age, and disability or ability, physical ability.
Thank you for that, Chancey. I just wanted to make sure we had like a basic understanding of that as we move forward. And then the next question that I wanted to ask is, again, like, let's get to the basics, like, what is planning? When we talk about urban planning, and we've been talking a lot about the community plan. Why should people care about planning? What is it? And how has it failed historically, working class people of color?
I could start, and hopefully Roderick and Carolyn could come in too. I don't want to dominate here, but I had a slide for that too, if you want to go back to a slide, because TICC has always been, for the past 26 years, engaging the community around planning and planning issues and helping them understand planning and the 101 of planning. It's in another, actually another file, Jimmy, that was the shorter file that I sent. If you want to look at the file I sent earlier, there was like 3 different files. Oh, I'm so sorry. But I'll just say that, yeah, we try to open up the planning process so folks can really understand what it involves, because it's very important that they have a say in how their community develops. We have predominantly, when working in minority communities that are low income, immigrant community members who are limited English speaking and monolingual, speaking in their respective languages, and maybe always in survival mode and just trying to make ends meet. But then when there's some kind of a development occurring in their neighborhood that may be a threat to their existence and livelihood, and not able to, exactly that, there it is, and that will not be able to allow them to continue living in that neighborhood, then it really becomes critical and vital for them to participate in the planning process and have a say, because they, being members of the community, are the prevailing voice and should have a say. And so we train them in not just leadership skills, but effective communication skills. And we help them understand the planning process and what planning entails, and then help them understand that as a member of the community, they have a right to go before the planning commission, before the city council, before the zoning administrator, to voice to all these powers that be, that they are not happy with this development. This development is going to displace them, and they they want to make sure that they're protected from this development and what have you. And so yeah, there's a lot of training involved. And so we have here the sort of community planning 101. And what, well, first of all, I guess, Jimmy, if you could go to the first slide with all these squares. Yeah, this one. So community planning 101, we have to define terms for everyone, what a general plan is, what a community plan is, what equity is, and what's affordable housing, what's rent control, what's zoning, what's displacement, what gentrification is, etc. And then if you go to the next slide, and then what is an equitable community plan? This, of course, I think folks who is working around equity in planning would agree that it would be a plan that would not displace low-income people, that would be oriented towards protecting low-income people like low-income renters and low-income tenants, that would provide the community its voice, and that would be sustainable and environmentally friendly, that protects local businesses and local jobs. So.
Thank you, Chancey. Does anyone else want to talk about just what planning is and why should people care about it?
Yeah, I do want to add that planning itself, it's both a practice and an institution. So here in Los Angeles, we have the Department of City Planning, and they are bound by laws and regulations that they're the power that be and that decides what gets built or what the programming on our streets, and just every facet when you walk down the street, it's really related to planning. But planning, when I say planning is a practice, it's more so related to who decides, and the types of the ways in which we engage different communities to understand what are the needs and what we need to build in those communities. So planning encapsulates so many things, where it's not just affordable housing, right? But it's how we move through our city, through different transportation, our freeways, our streets, our buses. Planning involves economic development. We look back to the discussion we had on small businesses, like how do we uplift small businesses at the same time. There's also like these big businesses that exist in their city, and how do those things interact with the surrounding neighborhood. So planning encapsulates so many things, and it's important for folks to understand planning, or to at least get an intro to it, because it really impacts our daily lives, from when you walk down the street, or when you're trying to apply for housing, or you see for sale signs up in your neighborhood, or it's all related to the institution of planning, but also the practice of planning.
Thank you so much. And I do want to note something during our conversation in preparation for this panel that I found to be very compelling, when Roderick actually said that it's taken us as, say, a nation, as, say, a society, centuries to arrive to this technocratic way of explaining our humanity and also our oppression, right? So as non-white bodies in this society that centers and privileges whiteness, we're now in the planning area, sort of trying to outline how to be more humanistic in our practice, right? And so I do think that spaces like these, where we're centering non-white voices and uplifting experiences of of what exclusion has looked like, what exclusion continues to look like, how that continues to impact us psychologically and socially, how we sort of come to accept our neighborhoods as having to bear the burden of poverty and then gentrification or displacement. All of these things have also taken centuries to develop, right? And centuries of planning just as well. The sort of beginning of this research exercise for us was the Federal Housing Administration handing out loans for white families and excluding Black and immigrants from the same entitlements, right? So it's taken us a long while to get here. And with all that in mind, I want to ask a little bit about this Hollywood Community Update Plan, because we're talking gentrification, we're talking equity, we're talking planning. How has the Hollywood Community Update Plan been in conversation with this or not, given our experiences with Hollywood and what we see on the ground currently and what we've seen on the ground historically, at least over the last 2 decades? Chancey, I know you're going to have much to say. So this is a question for all of us, obviously, and just please go ahead and take it away.
And if you guys could start out by first defining what the community plan is for anyone that doesn't know what that is. We want to make sure we're really accessible with our language. Thank you all.
Yeah.
No, Roderick, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you want to pull back up that slide, we can just read off the definition of what a community plan is from that. And then we can connect what we talk about to the slide that we were so graciously given.
Yes, that was exactly what I was about to say, Roderick.
The other one on the email, yes.
That one, go further up. Yeah, before that, there you go.
So the way I think about community plans, as a planner, I had the privilege of researching like Chinese cities and interning in Beijing and doing a little work in Taiwan throughout grad school. And then just thinking about this, you can kind of think about community plans as a way to impact your direct community, right? Like, we live in the city of Los Angeles. It's a pretty big city, right? You go from the San Fernando Valley down to the South Bay, really huge city from the west side to the east. But a community plan is a specific planning area confined to a smaller portion of the city of Los Angeles to discuss the totality of that community, you know, from parks to housing to jobs to everything that exists. And the example, of course, for that is the Hollywood Community Plan. Certainly the Hollywood that I grew up seeing on TV growing up in the East Coast is not the Hollywood I have come to know since moving to Los Angeles. And I was just talking to friends around how everything we've been told about Los Angeles from TV is not exactly what you see when you move here. You know, I thought I was moving to this progressive place with people of color and women and queer folks. You know, we were just like having a joyous time. And then I moved here and it was kind of like not exactly that at all. And so, you know, the question JT asks around, let's talk about this Hollywood Community Plan update and what's happening. I think first and foremost, what I learned today with what happened with the voting for the Hollywood Community Plan update is just very sad to see. I don't know any other way to describe it. You know, when I think, this is probably a comparison to draw, not to project onto the people who voted and how they voted. But when I think about South Africa and Johannesburg during apartheid and like what white minority rule looks like, as a newcomer to Los Angeles, I can't help but think that's how this city operates. You know, you have this planning commission that is majority white, and then you have something like the Hollywood Community Plan, where you got everyone in the community, white, Black, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, you know, just all these groups to weigh in. You got academic experts to weigh in. You got all these people to weigh in and say, hey, we don't always agree on everything, but like, let's really figure out what's going to work best for this community to come together and build a coalition, and you still got a majority white panel looking at something that came from like the margins of society and kind of ignored that, I can't help but draw those comparisons between, you know, like I said, Johannesburg and Los Angeles, and like what white minority rule looks like in a city where 70% of the population is people of color, and yet we continue to not be able to make decisions for ourselves. That is something for me that I don't take lightly, because it helps us understand that whether white people are the majority based on population or not does not necessarily mean that the power has been taken away or the power has been restructured to be equitable. But then on the same front, what I really liked about this Just Hollywood plan is that it really spoke to how do we get into the nitty gritty? How do we discuss setbacks and floor area ratios and all of these topics that seem very, very far removed from, you know, the person who's just waking up every day trying to pay the bills, but you're trying to talk about these policies in a way that captures affordability. It really lends itself to trying to do that. It lent itself to trying to discuss street vending and local businesses. You know, that's what, not only from street vending, but to the Thai marketplace, right? And bringing these businesses back. All of these things are things that like folks understood who do this work, who've been doing this work for longer than I've been alive, if I'm being honest. We're like, well, we know, like, okay, it's never going to always pencil out. It's never going to be perfect. But like, what can we try and get that doesn't feel like a compromise? And seeing that just kind of ignored and diminished by people, it's especially people who happen to also be white in this era. You know, we're coming out of not only 2020, but post January 6th, where we saw white folks try and like storm the Capitol. We just seen a white person kill 6 Asian women. We've seen a white man be arrested outside of the VP's house with an assault rifle this week as well. It's hard for us to not, I think, as people of color, not feel some type of way, because as the saying goes, the math is mathing. And right now, 1 + 1 is equaling 2 across the board with these issues. And so, you know, when I think about like what I saw with the Hollywood Community Plan, I was excited because as a planner and being trained in this field, I know that it's never going to be perfect for myself or other people of color. But I saw people trying to really speak to the technicality of these policies in a way that could at least mitigate harm for our communities in ways that, like I said, it's taken centuries to begin to re-articulate again and again, and that was still diminished. So I'll stop there because I know a lot of other people have stuff to say also about this community plan update, but it was very jarring and very upsetting, I think, to see that, especially after this, oh, we care for Black lives and stop Asian hate and, you know, get rid of ICE, abolish ICE. And we're going to put Black women as the marketing strategy for our initiatives. And we're going to make sure women of color are centered. But you do all of that. And then when we bring you solutions, especially because, you know, we're not paid to do that. You're the people paid as local government to come up with solutions. We go out our way to bring you solutions, and you still take it up, you tell us that's not appropriate or you deny that. I can't say it doesn't leave a bad taste in my mouth. So that's just how I feel. I'll leave it to others to kind of discuss how they feel.
Yeah, well, Thai CDC has been part of the Just Hollywood Coalition for quite some time, since it began. We've been following the Hollywood Community Plan update from the very beginning, and then it had been shelved because there was a lawsuit. So then it got it came back for more community input, and then we joined the Just Hollywood Coalition to address the need for more equity, hence the word just Hollywood plan. It really builds on current housing incentives and ensures that upzoning is focused on housing rather than luxury commercial development, and promotes our environment, and also tries to prevent the wave of displacement that has been hitting Hollywood as a result of the giveaways to commercial developers that allowed for more luxury commercial development at the expense of housing, and that displaced a lot of people. And so specifically, some of the actual recommendations from Just Hollywood Coalition called for community control over Hollywood hotel development through a conditional use permit. And so that's a really novel idea, because it really puts the control over hotel development in the hands of the community. And it would also, in this conditional use permit, ban the conversion of rent stabilized units into hotels, or at least require a 100% replacement with affordable units. And it would also prevent developer giveaways. It would upzone for housing, not for luxury hotels and not for commercial uses. And so this was a way to really incentivize affordable housing production through utilizing density bonuses and value capture. And so this
Chancey,
was really,
if I may slightly interject for a moment.
Yes.
Chancey, so let's just say that someone for the first time this morning, when they were having their cereal, they got up and they heard that there's a Hollywood community update plan. Just to situate us, what does that mean, a community update plan? What are we deciding here, or who is deciding what gets updated? If you could just help us situate this for someone who may be hearing about the community update plan for the first time.
Sure, yes, we did a lot of outreach and education around this too, to prepare the community to come out at these hearings. So when there's a community plan update, it's because studies have shown that there's going to be an increase in population, and Hollywood in particular is considered a regional economic center. So you're forecasting this huge growth of the population, and the need to mitigate traffic, and the need for more housing, supply of housing, and more jobs, and what have you. Of course, folks have also countered that, saying that the forecasting on population was much higher than it really is, and so there should not be then that much development. But nevertheless, it is a transit corridor, and so there should be some density around transit, but the question is whether it should be affordable housing around transit or market rate housing. So then what happens then is that the community plan needs to be updated, because the plan that was existing was based on population projections that are already outdated. And so when the community plan needs to be updated, then there's going to be a public hearing process for people to provide input, because the changes need to be made in the plan to accommodate that growth, supposedly, whatever that growth that has been projected. And so now it's an opportunity. So if people just woke up in the morning and heard that there's a Hollywood community plan update, then they should know that, oh, this is now time to update a plan that is out of date, that needs to be updated because of all these projections that were made by researchers and what have you. And if you live in Hollywood, then you should care and be concerned, because it's going to affect you, whether there's going to be enough housing, whether there's going to be more traffic, whether there's going to be amenities and greening and all of this. And so then there's a hearing. It's time for you to participate in that hearing and make your comments of what you think should be included in this plan. And it goes before the City Planning Commission. And these are made of folks, commissioners who are appointed by the mayor, who live in the city of Los Angeles. and who will be hearing from the public their input, and then they're a quasi-judicial body, so then they make a determination based on everything they've heard from various members of the community, the pros, the cons, etc. And on the advisement of the planning department, the zoning administrator, and the city attorney's office, whatever decision they make, hopefully would be a judicious one, and one that will be, of course, for the public benefit, because they have to take an oath of office that everything that they render, the decision that they render, should be only for the public benefit, not for the economic interest of any particular entity or person. And then that decision is made after they've collected everyone's input. So then that's how.
And I'd like to, because
that's how plan gets updated.
Yeah, and this relates a little bit to zoning. Can we talk a little bit about how zoning has created segregation and how it affects the availability of affordable housing in LA?
Yes, we can. One, I want to say, before I talk, Caroline, I'm always like, making sure everyone has kind of that space. So, if you want to take us away on this, I'm happy to do that before, I speak, or, take space, make space is always my go-to.
I mean, I think I can start off, and then Roderick, if you want to help me through it. But I will start with that. Zoning, it really determines the types of things that you're able to build in a neighborhood, or how high you can build. Can you build commercial? Can you build industrial, residential? When you build residential, what type of residential can you build? Is it a single family? Is it 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings? So zoning is the power of a city to be able to regulate, what is built, what is preserved in a city.
And yeah, if you want, go ahead, Roderick. Oh, do you want me to go ahead? Well, yeah, it's a tool that cities use to designate different uses, just like Caroline was saying, different land uses, like what's residential, what's commercial, what's industrial, how big the building should be, in terms of building sizes, and then how they should relate to the surrounding and other buildings, whether the rest of the buildings will all be like contextual or not, and whether there'll be open spaces, etc. So there's going to be zoning for industrial use, for example. And if you're going to develop something industrial, you obviously cannot go into an area that's zoned residential, because then you would be violating the zoning for that area, because there's already a zone for industrial use. So if you want to build something industrial, you have to go into that industrial use. And then there's a whole thing about variance, but that's a whole other issue.
So how has zoning been used to segregate communities, and how does it affect affordable housing today?
Yeah, so one, thank you for asking. When y'all started, as I've come into this new position, one of the things that I wanted in my title was spatial equity, because it has to be talked about. Land use, zoning, and the spatial environment, there needs to be a discussion around what equity looks like in our built and natural environments as we are trying to build better communities. What a lot of people don't know is on the residential front, for people who don't know, residential means, just homes. we used to be very explicit with our racism. You know, what we now refer to as single family zoning was once referred to as R1 white, is now referred to as R1 residential. And what we used to refer to as like multifamily and apartments and all these things were called R2 or above colored, right? So there was a clear distinction in our legality, in our policy, in our regulations around where white people should go and where the rest of us should go, right? And so that, with the combination of government-backed financing, the loans that we talk about with the, you know, post-World War II era, combined with the floor area ratios, the setbacks, the height restrictions, the tree canopy, all of that constituted and developed the haves, AKA the suburbs, and the have-nots, AKA the inner city. And those things work together in like they work together to formulate different built environments for different ethnic groups to then determine who was going to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the pursuit of stable housing, and the pursuit of all the things that we were promised in theory but never given in practice. Those things all work together, from the zoning to the regulations to the financing to the everything that is what we would now call the community plan. And we don't get into that often, and we don't get into it enough. And, you know, for me, we've seen this play out in the rural South. For my family, they try to put a plant, right? Because what we see happening with Stand LA right now is not in East Hollywood, but we know that even when we talk about zoning and land use, separating industrial from residential is only granted to white communities, right? You go down to Englewood, there's an oil field right next to the park. I just visited Kenneth State Park for the first time. And I was like, why am I seeing oil drills at the park, right? Like, why am I seeing that? And that's because our communities are not given the same luxury of setbacks. They're not given the same luxury of height restrictions and all these other things that make up where we live. And thus, we have to be given a different reality and a different spatial environment altogether. It's not just housing, unfortunately. If it was, it may be a little bit easier to address. And so when you ask about zoning and land use, again, the topology of the Americas is one that's best suited by someone like Deb Haaland, who was just, you know, recognized and nominated and confirmed and sworn in by a Black and Asian woman to manage our public lands. The typology of the Americas is best suited to be understood by the people who are curating and living with this land before any of us were on this land. And that's something I'm always going to hold near and dear to me. And so when you talk about zoning and land use, it's taking these theories that our ancestors lived on and just modernizing it and technifying it in a way that may or may not work for us. Like in China, I learned about the Sheng Shui theory, which is like mountain and mortar, and how like ancient Chinese civilizations curated the built environment to work for like their, you know, their world, like the reality they lived in. And that to me is beautiful, because it lends itself to understanding like what I need to do here in the Americas. And I don't think we do enough of that. And I don't think, you know, as folks of color, we have always, you know, we're always pushed out of things like environmental justice and climate change and land use. And we're told that we don't have a space in these areas, but like that at the end of the day is what's determining everything for us. It's determining, like I said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if we don't address that fundamentally, then I can't, like, I've lost sleep already about this, but like, you know, if we don't address that, I don't see us having a better world, because at this point we can talk about race, but we also have to talk about the fact that our planet is kind of at a standstill globally around climate change and whether or not we're all going to survive. And we know that people of color are more likely to be in the floodplains, in the fire zones, in the earthquake zones. We're more likely to be predisposed due to land use and zoning. And at this point, it is about our survival as people. And I got really hyped, but like, that's just, that's why I entered this field, because like, it's real.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the issues in Los Angeles specifically is that a lot of formerly like all white neighborhoods that had deed restrictions were zoned for single family housing, and they continue to push for only single family housing. So then it becomes really difficult for affordable housing and apartment buildings to be built in those neighborhoods. So then neighborhoods that don't have those strict zoning rules get the brunt of a lot of the construction, right? And I think one of the issues with the Hollywood update plan is that a lot of groups in the city wanted to expand the zoning for multifamily use, right? Like there's neighborhoods that don't allow for that. And if we're going to deal with the affordable housing crisis, we need to allow for more multifamily housing, right? So I think that was one of the issues that, for example, the Just Coalition group wanted, right? And it seems like that's what they're going to keep pushing for. I know someone asked, what are the updates in that plan, and why were you guys disappointed? Because I know y'all said it was disappointing, the decision, and I think people wanted to know a little bit about that specifically.
And just before that, I do think that that's an excellent point, and certainly like when you dial into the Hollywood Community Update Plan, you're going to hear a variation. You're going to hear the racial tension in the city playing out, and you will hear about people with specific business interests who care about floor area ratio being increased because that means that they have a better payout for their companies. At the same time that they call hillside communities communities for historic preservation. And one thing that really frustrates me as I hear historic preservation is historic preservation of which group, historic preservation of which lands in this city, in this state, if you will. But just to center us for a slight minute, I do want to give our audience a little bit of an example of zoning, and zoning especially in Hollywood. So here, a good friend of ours, Alyssa Walker, is actually tweeting about something known as the Target Husk, which was at Hollywood and Sunset for about 8 years, if I'm not mistaken. And actually the reason for this, the reason it took so long to build this Target was actually due to a zoning issue. So the area was sort of scaled for pretty low scale zoning, meaning only about maybe 2 stories at most were permitted. But actually what ended up happening during Councilmember Garcetti's time as the district representative for the area was that there was a spot zoning exception made here. And so eventually some groups got a hold of this plan and they said, hey, hold on, isn't that a violation of the low scale zoning that you've got for this? And so this took 8 years to litigate out. But here you can see that the sidewalk was closed. So that is to say that pedestrians needed to just cross. They had no access to the sidewalk in East Hollywood for 8 years, right? 8 years, and this is East Hollywood, where we have a predominantly immigrant / working class community. So it sort of tells you a lot about what bad zoning and bad planning is, right? Now to cap this off, I really do recommend for readers this article by Alyssa Walker as well. I waited so long for the Target store to open that I don't want it anymore. And it really sort of delves into the way that we sort of spent a long time getting this Target to the community. And ultimately, now that it's here, if you walk past this area, if you walk past this installment, you've got about 2 ground floors worth of parking lot. So it's almost designed for cars, right? As though we don't have enough cars filtering from out of the 101 freeway already. We just made more room for parking lots. And Alyssa Walker's article really points out that, hey, in terms of concessions from developers, we probably could have built housing right there. And so we're in an affordable housing crisis. You just look at the street across from the Target Husk, because the Target Husk is now heavily surveillanced There are unhoused people languishing on the street. We could have built housing right on top of the target. And so that's an example of bad zoning, bad planning, and then bad concessions from the developers, or bad concessions given to the developers, right?
Can I say something too about that? I'm very familiar with that project because I was on the Central Area Planning Commission at the time. First of all, the target development had to be in compliance with the station neighborhood area plan, because that's within a quarter to half-mile radius around the metro stop, that being the one that Hollywood and Western metro stop. So the developers had to really, or the developer had to really conform with the specific plan that restricted the height. And then the community wanted subterranean parking, but Target found that that was too expensive. And so when it came before my area planning commission at the time, I was trying to get concessions from Target that included local hiring, that if you're going to go a little higher than the height restrictions, that you would provide childcare, and you would to your employees, and that you would hire locally and what have you. And so they had agreed to that, but then of course, rightfully, the community had the right to sue because it violated the specific plan, which then went to federal court, and the federal judge agreed because it was a violation of the specific plan. And but then of course, like you said, it was back and forth in court, and then many years later, you basically then have what you have today, and none of the concessions that were agreed upon back then that allowed Target to build, and none of the not meeting any of the requirements that the community wanted as well, sadly.
So, just to situate us back in the neighborhood and in affordable housing specifically, we've learned that housing has been excluded for many years via practices like redlining, like deed restrictions, and we know that there's like a huge shortage of affordable housing in our neighborhood. And organizations like Thai CDC have been fighting for decades and have been successful at building and preserving affordable housing. And now we're actually gonna have a new development by the Little Tokyo Service Center on Vermont and Santa Monica. So Caroline, can you tell us a little bit about LTSC and what y'all are building on Vermont and Santa Monica?
Yeah, so I think we can pull up the slides starting from 46. But I hope that the following slides can build clarity and also awareness in what's happening on that corner at Santa Monica and Vermont, but also, add to the conversation of what does it mean to build affordable housing? Who is this housing for? And how do communities actually advocate for more affordable housing? So this is just like a picture of the proposed project on Santa Monica and Vermont. You can go to the next slide. Before I talk about the project, I just wanted to introduce the Little Tokyo Service Center for people who may not be familiar with our work. Our organization is a nonprofit organization. We are founded by a group of Japanese American activists who advocated for culturally responsive and linguistically responsive social services for the Little Tokyo community and broader Japanese American community in Southern California. In previous panels, we've discussed, the legacy of displacement and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Decades after that time period in the 1970s and 80s, we also saw hundreds of affordable housing units in Little Tokyo were demolished as a result of urban renewal projects throughout downtown Los Angeles. So the photo that you see here is just an image of the advocacy that LTSC is rooted in to preserve affordable housing. And in 1994, that's kind of when we started constructing, rehabilitating, and providing affordable housing in community spaces. So LTSC is, we believe in community control, we believe in self-determination, and so we're very honored to be working with the East Hollywood community on this project. So the next slide, please. The project, again, if you're unfamiliar with it, is situated on Vermont and Santa Monica. And so it is going to be right next to the Red Line station, next to the American Ranch and Seafood Market. And then also, the parking lots that, if you live in the neighborhood along New Hampshire, that huge parking lot, that's kind of where the development is going to take place. Next slide. So we are building 187 units of affordable housing, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. All the units will have access to an elevator. Each unit will have it, each resident will have their own bathroom. And it is there's also going to be appliances and energy efficient fixtures in each unit. Half of the units in this project are permanent supportive housing units. And so those will also be fully furnished with bed frames and desks and kitchenware and bathroom necessities. And because of the type of funding that this housing is utilizing, it is going to be energy efficient, transit-oriented development.
And what does permanent supportive housing mean?
Permanent supportive housing is a type of housing that is targeted to house homeless households. So when we say permanent supportive housing, it's not just about getting someone housed, but it's also about the services that are available to them so that they can retain their housing, so that they can also, find employment or get access to mental health services. So permanent supportive housing is not just about the housing itself and the affordability. It's about serving homeless households, and also adopting housing first principles where, we want people to be able to stay in their housing. The next slide. So if you're able to play the video, this is kind of like a walkthrough of the development. So we're coming up from Vermont Avenue towards Santa Monica. And so you can kind of see that the project itself is going to be 2 buildings, again, situated right next to the Metro Red Line station. And there's going to be a lot of on-site and off-site improvements, adding more signage, more trees to that area, and also hoping to have a pharmacy. And then on this right side, you'll see we're hoping to get like a legacy business food court. The video is kind of long, so we don't have to go through the whole thing, but just to kind of, so people can visualize. This is a very big project, 187 units right on the corner of Santa Monica and Vermont.
So rad, Caroline.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll make sure to share the slides.
And what does the legacy business food court mean?
So this particular project it's a project that LTSC did not do alone. It's actually, we're building off 3+ years of community outreach and community visioning, building off the work of like organizations and people like Thai CDC and Chancey. This project is really it's about, what the community wanted to see in their neighborhood. And so I think through previous community meetings, it was expressed that, a lot of small businesses, a lot of places that are dear to East Hollywood residents are leaving the neighborhood. And so people wanted to see an opportunity for some of those small businesses to return. Or we also learned from small businesses that they are experiencing rent increases. And I can imagine now, even during the pandemic, paying rent, as a small business. So the goal of this food court is to provide a chance for legacy businesses that have been around in East Hollywood for a long time to get access to affordable space to run their business.
Got it. And just to confirm, this will be 100% affordable, right?
Yeah, this will be 100% affordable. Again, the on-site where all residents will have access to social support services with our service partner, Housing Works. And again, Housing Works, and there will be an on-site property manager. We really believe in the principle of, ensuring that people can retain their housing. And so we'll work with community members, or we'll work with residents to ensure that they're able to stay, and then also cultivate a community that they feel comfortable and that they can grow and thrive. There will also be community rooms, outdoor courtyards, barbecue space, a garden that will be open. And then in the next slide, when we're thinking about like the neighborhood at large, there will be improvements to transit. The Metro will be building a bike hub at the development, and then we'll also see streetscape improvements. So things like lighting, trees, signage, trash cans, bike racks. Those improvements are possible because this is a transit-oriented development. And then we'll also have a federally qualified health clinic at the ground floor. And like I mentioned earlier, a pharmacy, convenience store. There will also be a small cafe space that, again, we do want to target legacy businesses, or, businesses that really have a stake in the community. And at the ground floor, we hope that the community rooms that we build at the ground floor will be spaces that the larger East Hollywood community will use, to gather and to, when we return to in person, have discussions like this in person. And we hope that it will be that kind of space for the neighborhood. When we say affordable housing, it's important to understand that this particular housing does target a specific income. And so we will be targeting households that earn at or less than 50% of the area median income. But like I mentioned earlier, half of the units, or 94 of the units, will be permanent supportive housing. And so those units will serve people who are at or below 30% of that income level you see here. So if you're trying to figure out, what income category do I fit in? It's like, what's your household size? Are you a 1-person, 2-person, 3-person? And then think about what's your annual income, and then try to find, am I at 50%? Am I at 45? So the income levels really are the categories of like, who will this, which income are we targeting? And these reflect maximum income levels. Just to note that it's not minimum, they're maximum income levels. And then in terms of the rent, it's very similar, that we are targeting 50% area median income and below. And so these rents are still being finalized, because we're still pushing through securing funding for this project. But then you can get an idea of what the rents will look like. And half of the units, the permanent supportive housing units, will also be supported through what they're called like Section 8 project-based housing vouchers. So they're the tenants who live in permanent supportive housing will also be assisted by vouchers. So they're not going to pay that full rent that you see there.
So how does a project like this happen? I think people are curious, you know, like, how does the funding happen? Like, is this too good to be true, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chancey can also speak to this, but building affordable housing requires an immense amount of funding, and that is because of the time it takes to develop your project, but also all the rules and guidelines that you have to fit your project within, you know. So there's also like the costs of, you know, the materials that are rising now, you know, in the US. So it is the funding for affordable housing is quite complicated, because it's not just one source of funding. You are accessing city funding, you're accessing county funding, state funding, federal funding. You need all these different types of funding sources to build affordable housing.
And how will the project ensure that it's actually going to the intended people, right? So like longtime residents and like extremely low income residents, how will that be ensured? And also, how can people apply for this?
So I think in terms of, you know, serving extremely low income and very low income households, the funding sources of this project do require some kind of income certification. So, you know, just to ensure that, you know, we are really serving extremely low income people through this project. And then, you know, I think in terms of, you know, who gets to apply, part of it is if you are homeless and you have to go through the coordinated entry system here in the city, and you will get a referral to apply to this project. The other units that are available at this project will be open to the general public, as long as you income qualify. But then I think in terms of getting people from East Hollywood to apply, I think that's where community partnerships and engagement is key. Because of, fair housing laws, there's no local preference in this particular project. I think other affordable housing, there are preferences like that, but for this project, it's kind of like anyone can apply. So community partnerships and community engagement in East Hollywood is going to be key to make sure that people in the neighborhood know about it, and that we have workshops about what we can do to get people ready to apply. And also, we want to continue working with groups like the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council to get the word out when we're ready to do the marketing for this project, so that folks in East Hollywood can apply and they can also be ready to apply.
Yeah, and I got just maybe two brief questions. that are also for the entirety of the panel. We're at about 2 hours now, and certainly we want to respect your time as well as that of our attendees. One, going back to financing for a slight moment, how are these projects funded? And then two, it's a two-part question. Why don't we have more of this across the city of Los Angeles? I think those are two well-connected questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, in terms of the funding, there's different pieces of funding that many affordable housing developers have to kind of seek. And some of it is, funding from the city and county. And those types of funding do require that you target a certain income. And there's also state funding where if you, because our project is next to a metro station, that there is funding to be able to do transit improvements as well as building affordable housing. And so there's multiple funding sources that we kind of have to seek and apply and get through. It's a really complicated process, to be quite honest. I started, how I got into affordable housing was I actually used to help people apply to affordable housing. That was my old job when I lived in San Francisco. And so I decided to go to planning school and learn more affordable housing, because I was I wanted to know why is it so difficult to build affordable housing in the neighborhood that I work in. And now that I'm here with you all talking about this project, I understand, because there's so many requirements and different funding sources. Not one funding source is going to fund the whole project. You need to have multiple funding sources to be able to fund your this kind of development. And also there's limitations for each funding source as well. So it's there's a lot of pieces to be able to build this type of housing. Yeah.
I mean, and it brings to the question, right? Why is it that nonprofits are kind of the ones having to deal with building affordable housing? It's clearly very complicated, so it makes it difficult for just nonprofits to solve the problem, right, of affordable housing. Can y'all talk a little bit about why it is that nonprofits are tasked with doing this and why the government isn't doing so?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate indeed that nonprofits end up filling the gap when really government should be building these types of projects, because they are so expensive and so complicated. And as Carolyn said, it takes layers and layers of what we call financing. You have to really understand financing to finance such projects. And I call it creative financing, because you have to get creative. You have to seek out multiple sources, seek out multiple sources like tax credits and grants and government funding and what have you. And so it gets really complicated, and then because it takes so much time from pre-development phase to development phase to then construction completion, it could take upwards of maybe 3 to 6 or maybe even 8 or even 10 years while people are languishing out there for housing. You have unhoused people, you have homeless people who need housing tomorrow, today, right now. And we really don't have time to spare and to take all that time to line up all the financing and to do the feasibility study and to do all the environmentals, and then to do then to get into finally the site acquisition phase, and secure the site and have site control, because you can't even get the financing until you have site control and show that you have site control. And so there's absolutely no reason why the U.S. Housing Urban Development Department should not be developing, producing more affordable housing and spending its budget on producing more affordable housing. It has had its budget shrunk over the past 30 plus years. That budget should be restored and then some and increased, and the federal government should get into the production of affordable housing, not the nonprofits. The nonprofits, it just does not make any sense when we have limited resources and funding and we have to go out there and seek all this financing. It makes no sense at all. And so there should be what we call social housing.
Thank you for asking that question. I certainly think, there's this podcast episode that I'll send to y'all to send out to all the attendees that I think is worth listening to. A Forgotten History of How the United States Government Segregated America. And in this podcast, they discuss government-built housing projects, and they discuss how housing projects went from being for poor white and lower middle class families to predominantly Black and poor, and how once it became a Black thing or a colored thing for the government to build housing, then they lost interest in it, right? So I think a lot of this, for those of us who are people of color, the history continues to show that when an issue becomes our issue, the government loses interest in it. It's not that the government was ever opposed to building housing, because they did it. And when they did it, they were specifically interested in doing it for white, middle class and working class families. It's when it became our issue that they lost interest. And I think that that's, again, back to the racialized question. I wish that that wasn't the case of this country, but every day we wake up and every time we look at things, it continues to show that when it becomes our issue, it's no longer a worthy cause of taking up. But thankfully, Alex Lee, who is Gen Z and a young person, a young Asian American, specifically a queer Asian American, introduced a bill alongside Buffy Wicks, and then Assembly Member Sidney Kamlager-Dove, who's now a senator for the state, around this concept of social housing and what it means for the government to get involved in building back better, just to continue to hone in on that point made by our own federal administration. I do think we are at a point where it shouldn't just be the nonprofit or the private sector stepping up to take care of our most vulnerable, because at the end of the day, we continue to see that it does not go far enough. We're not building enough homes. I'm not even going to say units or projects, because that kind of takes away the humanity of what we're trying to do, but we're not building enough homes for people. And it was nice for Caroline to show that in this development project, they're building 2-bedroom and some 3-bedroom homes. But again, we don't even have a finance system that allows us to develop family-oriented apartments, right? If you're going to have a family in the United States, it's predicated on you eventually owning a single-family home, which in California is not possible for probably any of us on this call, let alone any of those listening. And again, I just keep going back to my experience interning in Beijing, because one of my, we'll call them ex-friend, I don't know the label to give the man, but anyways, I visited his family's place, and when you get off the elevator at this apartment, the entire floor is the home. And it was his sister had a bedroom, he had a bedroom, his parents had a bedroom, they had a living room, they had a kitchen, they had an entire home that was in a multi-family building that worked for them. And they also were pretty well off. So it's not like they were just, low-income people. And there are places in this world that already show us what it means to develop communities and homes that work not just for studios and one bedrooms, but that work for families and that work for our elders. And I think even on this concept of social housing, I think the government is best posed to address that issue, where I don't just want to keep seeing one bedrooms, because one bedrooms may work for me as a single person, but do they work for the 5-person family that just crossed the border and are low income? Probably not, because that's a lot of people in a small space. And I don't think we talk enough about not only building more homes, but building more homes that really work for different styles of family. And coding gets into that because, you know, if you know about coding and this zoning, they were like, well, if you're not biological family, you can't stay together because, you know, that's not cool. And that's very, you know, queer phobic, because queer people, we typically have to live together in our own version of family in cities to survive, because a lot of us are leaving homes that didn't love us. It's not working for immigrant families. It's not working for a lot of people. And there's literally no precedent for why that should be, except for the case that like people want to continue to be bigoted, in my opinion. And so when I think about what the government has to offer, it is financing not just more homes, but homes that work for different cultures and different ways of being, from families to queer people to elders to single people. And the government has to step up and do that. Like, the private sector has already let us know that they can only go so far, including with like these requirements that we put forth, like inclusionary zoning or value capture. The nonprofit sector, they're nonprofits. They only got so much money. So they're only going so far to begin with, right? Like, they can only go so far. And so the only other industry left out of the conversation at this point is government. And what is government going to do to build back better? What is government going to do to house all of us? And it's not just let's put people in tiny homes and create what feels like District 9 or Mad Max, these movies that like are very apocalyptic. Is like, what are we doing to creating our version of Wakanda or our version of Coco? Or, you know, like Rava just came out and I got to get that movie on my Disney Plus because I got to watch it. You know, like different ethnicities around the globe who show us what family and community and culture looks like when we think about housing. And that is not just housing, that is like calling on Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, that's calling on Deb Haaland, that's calling on Secretary Fudge, that's calling on Michael Reagan, who just came out of North Carolina and was working with the EPA, and saying, hey, whether you're environment or interior or transportation or housing, we need y'all coordinating together at the federal level to think about how you're helping these communities that all of y'all came from and gave y'all the platform to be at the federal level. And that's going to take a lot of pressure, I think, to put on those people, but I think it's possible. And I don't see any other way to address this crisis except for the government at the federal and state level getting back into the building industry.
I want to take a moment to thank every panelist for such a fruitful and powerful discussion today. I think we have asked several questions just to demystify a little bit about planning, just to make sure that this is in fact community-based and something that our families can hear, right? Something that our workers can hear and also participate in. And so I do want to give space to Samantha for any more questions that we may have. And also just note that, of course, this project, this whole process for us has been supported by the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council. And if there is any segment of this that you want to analyze more of or review further, this is all on YouTube, on the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council's YouTube page. And of course, we are in community here, right? We are all doing respective work towards making our neighborhoods better places, safer places, and more inclusive places. And so that's a constant sort of refinement process that of course we need more support on. Of course we need more volunteers for, of course we need more voices for, right? So just want to give space to Samantha, for any more questions that we may have, and then thank you all once again for such a fruitful discussion this evening.
Yeah, I think, Rod, thank you for that note. I think that, leaves us in a really good place. And I think, noting that it's really a lot of the main solutions are systemic and are really like at the government level. But I do, just running this out of Hoover and people being frustrated by the displacement that they're seeing, by the gentrification that they're seeing, I do get a lot of those questions of like, what can we do? What do we do? What are the solutions? And I do want to leave people at least with something that they maybe can do in their daily life. Yearly, everyone has different levels of commitment that they're able to give to things. Whether you're a single working mom, your commitment is not going to be the same as if you work from home and live alone, right? So I just want to know if anyone can say anything about that. Like, what can people do to make sure that their neighborhoods are more equitable and that displacement isn't occurring as intensely?
I think there are different levels and different spaces that people can engage in. I think from an affordable housing perspective, if you know that there is an affordable housing project that's going to be built or might be in pre-planning stages, to go ahead and to engage with the developer of like what you want to see, but also if it's a project that you think is going to serve the community well, to go out and support it, because there are people who are against building affordable housing in your neighborhood, and they will spend millions of dollars to ensure that projects, affordable housing projects won't get built because they're afraid of like how it will affect their property value or whatever. So if you have the time to engage in that way, to like go out and to support those types of projects, yeah, I highly encourage. But then I also think that one of the biggest reasons why someone may leave like their unit or their building is because they don't know their tenants' rights. And I think we talked about it at the last panel. I think another way is to really try to learn more about tenants' rights. That you don't have to leave if your landlord tells you that they're going to sell the building. Like, you can fight for your housing. And I think those are two different ways that I think would really help a neighborhood if we get more people to do that.
I would just add that, like, I think, we do have to be realistic that not everyone has capacity to organize all the time or to show up. Like, I grew up, my mom was a single mom, had 3 kids, before she got remarried. She didn't have time, like, for a lot of reasons, there would never be time for her to show up and organize in these spaces because she has more than enough to worry about. So I think if you're in that bucket, you should not, one, be even thinking about how can I do more than I'm already doing, because you're doing enough to just stay afloat. But for those of us who are in a position of privilege, such as myself or others, to really show up, there are a lot of organizations in LA County, not only like nonprofits like Thai CDC or Little Tokyo Service Center, but also, more nonprofits who are on the advocacy side who you can get involved with to speak on this. And it's not just from the standpoint of like, oh, well, you need to know your tenants' rights because that's going to be important for you if you're in that situation. But also there are groups that can really help orient you into creating better communities overall, because so often as people of color and as poor people and as marginalized people, we're always playing defense. We don't get to play offense. We don't get to create Wakanda or Coco or any of these other places that we love and see in cinema that bring us, you know, this little glimpse of joy. But there are places where you can do that in LA County and specifically within the city of LA and East Hollywood. And I can certainly send out some of the places that I've just been following, you know, such as like LA Forward, which I think is a great organization, especially for myself as a newcomer, where you can get involved in this. And I also think like it's important to know, even if you can't show up at city council to give a vocal comment, you can submit public comment to some of these motions and some of these things that allow you to weigh in. And if that's all you can do, you should feel comfortable doing just that and putting that pressure. And last but certainly not least, as a person on their neighborhood council, and this was sponsored by a neighborhood council, you can certainly connect with the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, because that neighborhood council is like one avenue of having your voice heard in local government. It's a way to get directly to your council member. It's a way to get directly to the mayor or to the council president, and letting those people know that, hey, I live in this city, I care, you look like me, you come from our communities. And I think it was Al Sharpton who just said, we didn't put you in these positions to get comfortable. We put you in these positions to advocate for us and to advocate for our needs as people of color, as poor people. And so you can continue to do that in your own way, I think, as people on this call, as residents of East Hollywood, even if you are white, because I've talked to a lot of people who live in the neighborhood who are white, and they also care. You can also get involved and speak up and say, let's reorient ourselves and do something different.
Yeah, I totally appreciate what both Caroline and Roderick said. When working with marginalized and disadvantaged, low income, and predominantly immigrant communities with limited English proficiency, who is on survival mode most of the time and just trying to make ends meet and are struggling day to day, it's really hard for them to think of planning as a force in their life and as something so critical and vital that they have to be engaged in. That's the last thing they want to think about, that they even are aware of and even would even know. So it's really hard to put the burden on them, but it's also very important to help them understand how they can play a role and how important their voice is, so that their voice does not get dismissed and that they do have a voice. And so yeah, it's always going to be a challenge, and that's why community organizations like Little Tokyo Service Center and TICC, we have to just continue doing around-the-clock community engagement and outreach and mobilization and help them know their rights, especially if they're tenants, and know that they have rights and they can't just be unlawfully evicted. And then know that they can have be a force for change, a change agent, and have a voice in this process and prevent any kind of displacement and what have you. So we have to kind of facilitate that process, and we have to provide that opportunity. But it takes being on the ground, and it takes really grassroots organizing, and it takes having the pulse of your community and knowing their unique needs and some of their language and cultural barriers, and helping them overcome all of that in order to get to a stage where they feel a part of the community, because they are existing on the margins, that they really don't feel like they're part of any community.
Thank you so much, everyone. We really did this 2.5 hours. It's a lot to get through, and I really appreciate it. Every insight was super important, and thank you everyone that stuck around until the end and who attended all our panels. I hope this was enriching. I hope it deepened your relationship to the neighborhood. I hope you learned something new. Please follow Thai CDC, Rod Hall, Little Tokyo Service Center, Jimbo Times, this side of Hoover, to continue engaging on these topics. And if you want to support Jimbo Times and this side of Hoover, we are selling a magazine about these issues, about these 3 panels. And you can pre-order that. We're gonna go to print next week, but it'll be at jimbotimes.com. So that's how you can support our work. This was a labor of love. We've been working on this since October, and we're really, really thankful to everyone that helped us out, from neighbors to organizations, all our collaborators, everyone that tweeted about this, our designers. This was really, really a beautiful collaboration and an intersection of so many identities and experiences. And it really, if we want to talk about the future, I think a project like this, you know, I hope that it can continue in the future and that other neighborhoods can replicate these types of events. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sammy. Thank you so much to the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council. Thank you to Ninoshka Suarez, all of our participants, every single attendee who's made it to all 3 panels, which is not easy. We did like a seminar or a semester's worth of work in just 3 weeks here, which is really convenient for some of us, especially those of us who don't like long semesters and quarter systems at school, right? But also just a note, we will be actually transferring Spanish audio language translation to the panels. So that's coming within, say, the next week. So check back with this side of Hoover and Jimbo Times so that we can pass these talks along, especially to our Latinx residents. And hey, if you all know anyone who may be interested in translating these discussions further, get us in touch. Why not? We're going to have slightly more time on our hands, having concluded this series that has taken so much for us, but that we've done with a lot of honor, because we are honored to be in this community with all of you. And we look forward to the days ahead in stronger union and in stronger purpose. So this is work towards that end. Absolutely. Thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Cheers. Thank you again.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.